Okay, good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear listeners. I'm very glad to welcome you on the second meeting of the Nabokov seminar held by the Institute of Russian Literature of the Russian Academy of Science. And the topic of our today's meeting is Lolita Effect, Nabokov's novel in today's art and public discussion. And as you may understand, we will focus on Nabokov's Lolita and also on two recent novels, My Dark Vanessa by Кейт Элизабет Расселл, called the Lolita written in Me Too era, and the novel Consent, written by the French author Vannessa. I will try to pronounce it correctly, Springora, I think, but my French colleagues, I hope, will correct me. And my name is Polina Boyarkina, and I work at the Institute of Russian Literature. And now I would like to give the floor to my co-moderator, Tatiana Ponomareva, who also works at the Institute of Russian Literature.
Yes, I think, yes, my sound is on now. Yes, thank you, Polina. And I'm very happy to see everyone and hello to everyone who is watching us, those who I can't see, but those who are watching us. We're very happy to know that you are with us today. And before I joined the Russian Literature Institute, I worked in the Nabokov Museum for 20 years. And I know very well how different the perception of Nabokov's novel is still with different people. And I can still remember our teenage visitors who would say, like I remember one of them ago, about Lolita's age. She was, I think, 16, the age when Lolita died. And this girl told me, I like this novel very much. And I asked her, why do you like about that? She said, well, Lolita, she had such an interesting life. So what else? There's much to say about that, of course. And I think this is probably the reason why this novel resonates so much. And I'm very glad that there are these two writers who contributed into the way this novel should be. And I hope that those teenage girls, that girl who asked me this question, who told me that in the museum, I hope she's grown up now. And I hope she reads the novels, and I'm sure that her perception will change. Just one more thing before we start. As I learned, the connection between the name of these two women, the two Vanessas, and butterflies is not known to all our readers, to all the readers, maybe not to all the listeners. So Vanessa is not only a name, it's also a name of a butterfly. There are two butterflies with that name, Vanessa Io and Vanessa Atalanta. Both of them are very common. Both of them appear very often in Nabokov's work. And so this, when I was preparing for this seminar, I was just, this seemed unbelievable to me that there's this, it's just a coincidence. Obviously, this is one of those Nabokovian coincidences that the author named her protagonist Vanessa, and then there is this other French author whose name is really Vanessa. That's what she's called. And this makes this whole story really as if written by Nabokov himself. So let's now speak about it more in detail. And Polina, will you please introduce our keynote speaker now?
Tatiana Olegna, maybe we start with introducing all our speakers, then we will give the floor to.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I forgot. Yes, I'm sorry. Of course, I should do that because before we go on. So our speakers today are from different countries, from different cultures, and I think this adds very much to the range of our discussion, because we have our keynote speaker is Brian Boyd, who I'm sure is known to everyone. So he is let me just remind that he is the author of this wonderful 2-volume biography of Nabokov, which is still something that everyone is relying on when writing about Nabokov, and of other books on Nabokov. And of course, we're very honored to have Brian today as our speaker. We have 3 speakers, 3 French colleagues who we've known for a long time: Agnès Delgois, Julie Loisonchard, and Marie Boucher, who will speak about the French part of today's discussion, the novel by the French author, which is a real life story, which of course makes it even more, as when we talked to Brian, he called it creepy. Yes, that's really that. It is creepy. It is a creepy story, as Lolita's story is creepy, and the Vanessa novel is, but the creepiest obviously is the French novel, because it's based on real life events. And so we'll talk about that. And our colleagues are all Nabokov scholars working in French universities, and they all publish on Nabokov, and we know them very well as scholars. And we have and I think the Russian speakers, as I understand, will be introduced by Polina, right? Do I understand?
Yeah,
correctly?
thank you very much.
Because you know them better than I do.
Yes, and I would like to introduce my colleagues who are, besides interested in Nabokov and worked on Nabokov, are interested in modern literature and write about it a lot and talk about it often. So I would like to present philologist, literary critic, and journalist Igor Kirienkov, and philologist, journalist, literary critic, and translator Lisa Birger. And now I think we can start. So I would like to give the floor to Brian.
Please, Pauline, please, yes. Brian's sound is off. Pauline, could you turn it on? Brian, we can't hear you. Let us.
I'm sorry, I need to figure out which one. Which one should I?
No, that's
because
that's the one where we have the picture of Brian. The image.
Yeah, but unfortunately, in my list, I just have 2 similar names.
You could try both.
Okay.
Because they come one after the other, so try both.
I've unmuted. But,
yes.
But
No,
I can hear you now. Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's the wrong one. Now I think it's the right one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Spoiler alert, trigger warning, hashtag, terms Nabokov never knew. Spoiler alert, trigger warning, Lolita is about child abuse, about child rape. But it's also, I want to stress, about many other things, much more so than Кейт Элизабет Rassell's fine novel, My Dark Vanessa, or Vannessa Springore's brilliant memoir, Consent. To acknowledge these other things in Lolita need not be to minimize or evade the horror of the abuse of Dolly Hayes that Nabokov feels, that attentive readers should feel, that even Humbert claims to feel. As readers, we should not make ourselves even more narrowly obsessive than Humbert. After all, he can evocatively and memorably describe tennis, chess, movies, comics, ads, paintings, motels, barbers, hitchhikers, cars and their occupants and their flow along the highway and the terrain they drive through. Instead of narrowing to Humbert's obsessiveness, we should try, like Nabokov, to use the mind as an instrument of freedom. There's so much in Lolita beyond the child abuse. The succession of dazzlingly surprising scenes perfectly invented and realized in their psychological, social, natural, and sensory detail. The play, the humor, the supple and wry self-consciousness, the structural ironies and teeming patterns, the variety of vistas on America and on modern life and landscapes and culture, the range of themes, time, unpredictability, irretrievability, insatiability, chance and fate, memory, imagination, freedom, independence, manipulation, control, attraction, desire in its overwhelming presence or its utter absence, love defined by what it isn't. Excuse me, I'll just have to turn this sound off here. Love defined by what it is. Oh, sorry. Love defined by what it isn't. Rivalry, jealousy, murder, revenge, the dark shadows that cannot help being cast by the brilliant light that consciousness throws on our world. One of the themes least considered and most relevant to the present Me Too moment is the ethics of literature. At least since Homer showed the bard Demodocus moving his audience to laughter, and then Odysseus as tale-teller, moving the same listeners to tears, artists have promoted the impact and value of their art. However individual they may be as artists, they need others to tolerate and support what they do, because art cannot exist in a social vacuum. But for good and ill, artists also resist others' criteria for art's value, for fear the terms others propose may restrict their freedom. Nabokov simultaneously asserts and undermines the value of his most controversial work when he winds John Ray Jr. up to the peroration at the end of his foreword. As a case history, Lolita will become, no doubt, a classic in psychiatric circles. As a work of art, it transcends its expiatory aspects, and still more important to us than scientific significance and literary worth is the ethical impact the book should have on the serious reader. For this, in this poignant personal study, there lurks a general lesson. The wayward child, the egotistic mother, the panting maniac. These are not only vivid characters in a unique story, they warn us of dangerous trends. They point out potent evils. Lolita should make all of us, parents, social workers, educated, apply ourselves with still greater vigilance and vision to the task of bringing up a better generation in a safer world. At first, Nabokov could seem in cahoots with his invented editor, blunting the scissors of potential censors. But soon the very rhetorical energy that he pumps into Ray's voice so thoroughly ironizes and undermines the editor's claims to Lolita's ethical value as to call them completely into question. The poet's phonic play point out potent evils, vigilance and vision, slyly winks behind, even as it amplifies, the morals crusader's impassioned earnestness. However we might defend Lolita or art, Nabokov implies, the claims to an immediate use made by leer-eared moralists and message gatherers, to cite the novelist William Gass, can only fall woefully flat. But this is not to deny the morality of artists and art at their best. Nabokov famously writes in his own afterword, "I am neither a reader nor a writer of didactic fiction, and despite John Ray's assertion, Lolita has no moral in tow. For me, a work of fiction exists only insofar as it affords me what I shall bluntly call aesthetic bliss, that is, a sense of being somehow, somewhere, connected with other states of being, where art, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy is the norm." To some, that has seemed an affirmation of self-enclosed aestheticism. Far from it. A key element of Lolita is its critique of oversimplified criteria for what is of value in literature or life. Despite affirming that Lolita has no moral in tow, that it's not like a plane circling over a stadium trailing a message for all below to see, Nabokov prodded his friend Edmund Wilson, who was reluctant to read the book. When you do read Lolita, please mark that it is a highly moral affair. When a French journalist suggested the novel was amoral, the novelist resisted and insisted. On the contrary, it is a very moral. Don't harm children. Now, Humbert does. We might defend Humbert's feelings for Lolita, but not his perversity. Women sexually abused as girls, both those who have been irreparably damaged by the abuse and those who have triumphed over it, as well as psychologists and therapists of sexual violence and abuse, have hailed Lolita for raising a once taboo topic, for anticipating what research has since revealed about paedophilia, and for penetrating accuracy in depicting a predator's motives and tactics and a victim's plight. Yet even such tributes, however admirable, far from sum up the range of a great work's value. Chekhov wrote to his friend, the editor Alexei Suvorin, "You reproach me for my objectivity, calling it indifference to good and evil, absence of ideals and ideas, etc. You want me to say when I depict horse thieves, horse stealing is a bad thing. But that's been known a long time without my help, hasn't it? Let juries pass verdicts on horse thieves. As for me, my work is only to show them as they are." The evils of sexual abuse are anything but as straightforward as the evils of horse stealing, as the confused heroines of Russell's novel and Springore's memoir show with so much nuance, and as the creepy French reception over decades of the work of Springore's abuser, Gabriel Matzneff, reveals. Nabokov both declares Lolita has no moral in tow and is highly moral. But Chekhov is right. A rich literary work cannot be deemed valuable solely on moral grounds, especially when exploring human life fully and imaginatively will often mean exploring immoral behavior from the inside. A great literary work can be a tool shed of uses or a treasure house of values and offer a different array of resources from those in any other literary work, and different too for even different readers of the same work. The best art, like the best science, critiques itself, both building on and challenging what has gone before. In Lolita, Nabokov throws down a strong challenge to his own chosen art. Despite John Ray Jr.'s foreword, Humbert's confession shows literature cannot guarantee superior sensitivity or conduct. Again, just as Strain's gifts as a teacher of literature demonstrate in Russell's novel, and G's gifts as a writer make plain in Springore's memoir. It's no accident that the two men who prey on Dolly Hayes are both littérateurs. One, a scholar and poet who tries to marshal Dante, Petrarch, and Poe as precursors, exemplars, and excusers of his own love for Dolly. The other, a playwright who knows his Aristophanes, Shakespeare, Moliere, Sheridan, Shaw, and Maeterlinck, and who has fashioned many plays for children. Humbert, the lone, tense, scholarly European, draws on literature as exalted romantic aestheticism, as if it underwrites what he thinks the rare elevation and refinement of his passion. Quilty, the relaxed, gregarious, and populist American, sees little difference between art and commerce, piquant pleasure and pornography, the slick and the sleazy. Both are well-read in literature, but neither morally better for it. Many have stressed the power of literature to exercise our empathetic imaginations and thereby to expand our sympathies. The psychologist Steven Pinker observes, reading is a technology for perspective taking. When someone else's thoughts are in your head, you're observing the world from that person's vantage point. Not only are you taking in sights and sounds that you could not experience firsthand, but you've stepped inside that person's mind and are temporarily sharing his or her attitudes and reactions. As he notes, Some novels thereby demonstrably exposed a wide range of readers to the suffering of a forgotten class of victims and led to a change of policy by raising public awareness of the suffering of people who might otherwise have been ignored. But Pinker also notes the dangers of empathy. It can subvert human well-being when it runs ahead of a more fundamental principle, fairness, by making us prefer over others those we merely happen to know or ally with. Like G in his work as Consent describes, Humbert does all he can to make us ally with him, to make us observe the world from his vantage point. He even presents himself as a victim of the arbitrariness of rules that decree a girl of 9 or 12 off limits, of the fate that seems to have left him stuck with Valeria, of the unwelcome attentions of Charlotte, or like G writing about V, of Lolita's failure to appreciate his passion. However preposterous these claims might seem once we wriggle free of the coils and suckers of his prose. But despite his pride in his literary sensibility and refinement, Humbert refuses to let himself see from Dolly's perspective, even though he hears her sobs in the night, every night, the moment I feigned sleep. As Nabokov shows, literature does not guarantee elevation of conduct or extension of sympathies. Those who engage in and with literature are too various, and literature itself would run counter to its own deepest nature in seeking to impose a rigid and rigidly enforced uniformity of response on the diversity of real readers. But here in Lolita, Nabokov invites us to become good readers. Remember the title of the first lecture in his lectures on literature, Good Readers and Good Writers. He invites us, as we respond to Humbert's perspective, to reject that perspective precisely for its failing to consider or see Dolly's. Lolita invites us to confront the human capacity to ignore the suffering of others in the supposedly refined and sensitive Humbert, to see beyond the blinkers of our roles as protagonists and narrators of our own stories, and beyond the privileges and power our education may give us, to expand our sympathies to those with little power or voice, like Dolly Hayes, or for that matter, deaf Dick Schiller, or his one-armed neighbour. Literature at its best, Nabokov suggests, can invite, though never ensure, an expansion of human possibilities into a world where curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy become the norm. Ecstasy in its root sense of standing outside oneself, not at all in the sense of Humbert on the Davenport crushing out against Lolita's left buttock, the last throb of the longest ecstasy man or monster had ever known. Art guarantees nothing, Nabokov's critique of artists Humbert and Quilty suggests. But then this complex world precludes large guarantees. But all the same, literature can seed creative and sympathetic imaginations among millions of readers. I know no other work that so strongly invites readers both to respect the independence of others and to demarcate its limits. By showing this independence exalted in himself by Humbert and assaulted in others by his manipulation of everyone in his path, including his readers. Lolita is above all about the reality of other people, about their independence, their different natures and interests, their right to be acknowledged so long as they don't impinge on others. Nabokov invites us to try to read independently of Humbert, while seeing how much independence he, as author, has given his hero and narrator, and how little Humbert has given Dolly. And he invites us to read with him and see how much independence he tries to suggest in Dolly and to foster in us. Let me say again, Nabokov does not want us as readers to narrow to Humboldt's obsessiveness, but to open up our minds, the instrument of our freedom, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy. Thanks for listening.
Brian, thank you very much. And now I would like to, maybe we can have one quick question for Brian while we go further. Maybe Tatiana Olegovna, maybe you have.
You mean I can ask? No, I just think that maybe I suggest that we have questions afterwards, because I think that will just make the picture more varied when we can ask questions after we listen to our speakers. What do you think? I suggest that.
Yeah, that's possible, but maybe there are something that might be asked just now while the memory of
okay. Then I have
fresh,
actually
but only one. Yeah. Okay.
I have one question, if I can ask it now, because that's what I think the question that probably only Brian could answer. When I was preparing, because I didn't know about the French novel. I learned about it some time ago, actually, from I think the Facebook page of one of our French colleagues. And this was, I was so shocked that I couldn't imagine such things existed. And one of the things, of course, that was shocking was that the author, that this French writer, is of Russian origin, and his parents are Russian, and they are also Russian immigrants, and they lived in Paris in the same time when Nabokov lived there. And in one of his interviews, he says that among his parents' friends were Russian writers and critics who we know very well. Like he mentions Adamovich, for example, and Machursky, and maybe others. So my question to Brian is there any evidence that Nabokov may have met the parents of this writer? What, do we know anything about that?
None that I know of, but then I wasn't looking for names, so it's possible that it is buried in some of the things I've transcribed, or who knows. I think it's unlikely. But there's an odd connection of maybe I don't want to steal the thunder of the French colleagues, but it struck me as being extraordinary that Matzneff appeared on Apostrophe 2 years before Nabokov did, which is, yeah. If Nabokov had known that, he would have been outraged. I would have thought he, well, maybe he knew the reputation of Apostrophe, but I guess he didn't regularly watch it.
Yes, and I don't think there is any evidence that Nabokov himself knew about this writer or his well, what do we call it? Writings, his writings. Well, obviously not.
Till just before Nabokov's death. So.
Yes, there was some. Yes, the worst thing he wrote was in '75, as I know now. So yes, it's unlikely that Nabokov would have spent his time reading or learning about these writings.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tatiana Olegovna, thank you very much for your question. Brian, thank you very much for your answer. And now I would like to ask Lisa Birger to talk a little bit about Vanessa, My Dark Vanessa, written by Кейт Элизабет Расселл and translated recently into Russian. And this novel caused a huge discussion in Russian, I wouldn't say the whole society, but literary-oriented society. Lisa?
Hey. So
Thank you.
It was amazing to hear Brian, and I feel very honored to be there because I'm not a scholar myself, but though not being a Nabokov scholar, I was educated by one. My teacher, Alexei Zverev, wrote a book on Nabokov and tried to, how would we say, like maybe in some way copy him in reading his lectures. So me, myself, being a literary critic more than a philologist and a writer, I do love reading and literature and reading deeper than we could. And I understand many points of Brian's lecture, and I can share many of them. And for me, myself, my Dark Vanessa is more of a question than of an answer. But I guess it is an important book for several reasons. So as you, I think every one of you know, but I would say it again, the book came out in English in, I think, spring 2020. So it's only 1 year old in English as well. And it's been translated several months ago into Russian. The translation just went out. And it's a book about where a woman, 32 years old, remembers how she was seduced at 15 by her teacher. Like, her name is Vannessa and his name is Jacob Straight, and he was 42 at that moment. And the trigger, the word that Nabokov didn't know, the trigger to all this remembering is the new accusations that came out against him. And the story is told completely from the first person. We only hear her side of the story and from her. But the problem is, and what makes this novel a powerful and beautiful reading and really beautifully constructed, that she is not sure about anything. And she even says at some point, I don't know what I know, she says. So like, she's not sure about anything at all, and she cannot put value, and she cannot estimate the things that happened to her. And she's rethinking and rethinking them, realizing slowly that what happened with her 17 years ago was an abuse. For her, it was a love story. And what Кейт Элизабет Расселл told herself later, that it's her personal story. So I want to come back to that. But that also she started writing this book as a teenager, and she started writing it as a love story. And by writing it, while writing it, she realized that it's not, that it's actually a story of abuse. And the seduction, let's call it like that, in the novel, it starts with Straight giving Vanessa a copy of Lolita, which is annotated and underlined, which I find beautiful, because it's a little bit a story about how we read the stories. And Vanessa gets the stories already read for her. So she gets it with being prepared to read it in a proper way, in the way that her teacher wants her to read it. And that repeats later in the story when he meets another teacher who also tries to seduce her, and he gives her another book, and it's also underlined. So the whole idea of like giving someone the book but pointing out how you should read it is one of the centers of Vanessa. And what the author, Кейт Элизабет Расселл, says herself is that she loved Lolita as a child. And she was obsessed with it. And she read it several times. And for her, it was a love story again. And only by growing up, she realized that it actually isn't. I never read anything that used language the way Lolita does. But at the same time, I was a 14-year romanticizing everything about these ordinary girls who felt so close to me. Here I remember Hanya Yanagihara, who is another important author for Russian readers. She calls Lolita one of her favorite books, as one of her favorite books, but she said she never read past the first 100 pages. So it's so beautiful, so she's unable to read it further. So Кейт Элизабет Расселл also claims Lolita to be the most beautiful book she ever read. Like, she doesn't, I don't know, put guilt on it, or like it's the most beautiful book she ever read, but like it's wrong. And what's interesting for me, several points I want to find out. So I want to point out that first, My Dark Vanessa is a beautiful book because it has a lot of fine literary qualities. It has an unreliable narrator. it has a really interesting structure when we realize slowly what really happened, and when the reader knows more than the narrator in some point, just because the reader knows more at this point about the abuse and how abuse is and how people are victimized and how it all happens. So it's beautifully built. On the other hand, my Dark Vanessa is a call out to all the stories of abuse in literature, about romanticizing young girls in literature. And you cannot deny it, it's happening. When I was thinking later about it, like loving Nabokov and not blaming his novel in any little while for anything that happened with any little girl in the world. Like not blaming, he is not responsible. It's like blaming the gun for its firing. It's like they are not the same. But I realized that what Brian said about the good reader and for Nabokov being so, we're bad readers. So the problem is not Nabokov itself. The problem is not that we cannot read. The problem is that we cannot read properly. And Vanessa pointed out so beautifully. And the discussions that we had in Russian Facebook or like social media or around Vanessa was exactly that so many people felt offended for Nabokov that Кейт Элизабет Расселл in his novel finds him guilty for romanticizing the abuse. And it's an interesting situation because she doesn't. She doesn't, but at the same time, she's very modern. And as a modern novel in modern times, it has to change the point of view. And what's interesting about it, when I was looking for the reviews about Vanessa in the English media, I found beautifully the Elle magazine says, my Dark Vanessa asks what's reality and what's fiction anymore. And the modern approach is that we cannot separate them so hard from each other. Fiction has to be connected to reality in some way and has to answer directly to the reality. And there I said I'd return to that later. I found it very interesting that Кейт Элизабет Расселл was blamed for her novel, for not having enough experience and not having right to write it. And while in the foreword to the novel, she claims that it never happened to her personally, she has to take it back later and to say, it's my personal story. And that's why I told it like that. So in the modern time, it has to be your personal story. It has to be your real experience. And you have to give voice to what you personally went through. And there's another book that was important in this way, and Igor wrote about it several times. It's a book that's called The Real Lolita, about the girl who inspired the Lolita, yeah? And the same, I remember when this book was discussed, everyone was also saying, you should give voice to the victims. So in the give voice to the victims situation, we can blame Nabokov's novel. The guilt of Nabokov's novel is just for not giving the voice to the victim, to giving the abuser. And so whatever he's trying to achieve in the eyes of modern society is not achievable just by this, which I find really interesting. I do think that My Dark Vanessa is a beautiful novel. I don't think it's a simple accusation. I think it has to be discussed. And what I'm curious about is how the reading and the approach to reading and the approach to literature is going to change in these times, because we realize as readers of Nabokov that nothing is direct, and the beauty of literature is of ability of telling stories in different ways, or believing that reader can join you in a more interesting path. But it's not what's happening right now. And will it change forever? Will the Nabokov novel never be read as it was read? That's the question that I have.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. Maybe I can use my position as a moderator to ask one small question. I think it's connected to the whole point of your presentation about how we read and what how our background impacts our reading, because the discussion I was referring about Vanessa in our social media, I meant the fact that basically we can say that the novel was read in two opposite ways. It was some people said keep saying, like with Lolita, that it's a love story, and the others were saying that it's not at all. It's the story of abuse, and that also. For me, of course, when I read it,
It's really beautiful. I know what you say. And like for the main literary critic in Russia who said it was a love story, and she proved it. And it's really, it was painful to read, honestly. And I found it very funny that Galina Yusufovich, who I love dearly, she did so many good things for all of us. But while claiming that it's a love story and that actually that Strain loves Vanessa and she just cannot understand it, she also in the same, like maybe in the same article, she writes like, but people cannot read anymore. And it's really interesting because it's obvious for the modern reader when, I mean, when I say modern, I mean maybe or knowing also something about the Me Too novel, movement, or something about abuse. You have to know just a little bit to understand what's going on in the novel. And this is the thing, this is the difference between us reading and the heroine, the protagonist of My Dark Vanessa story, because she is happening before. I remember she's like, it's like 15, 20 years before. And she is not in the Me Too movement. As she's not, like, her eyes has not been open to how we see now the abuse or the abuse of power or whatever. She never knew about it. She never read about it. Like, it's all new to her and she has to discover by herself. But as a reader of 2020, you did hear stories, you did read stories, you did hear the discussion. Like, you cannot open a newspaper, or any media without knowing what's going on and the modern approach to it, and the modern approach to the abuse of power, even not of, because there is an abuse of power as well. So what I find here, it was painful to read. There were several reviews that claimed that it's a love story and people just don't understand it properly. But I think it's about Russia, and it's about our deep, very deep questions and very deep relationship with power and abuse. And that we have to go the long way in realizing what's happening that has nothing. So what I mean by saying all this, I mean that, like, to read this novel properly, and I do believe it's a proper way of reading, you need to have some understanding of things that are not belonging to the literature itself, that are not literature things. And I think it's quite clear what's happening in the novel if you read it through, and if you read it carefully. And one of the, like, you don't have to prove it here, I don't think so, but one of the improvements that you can take is the sexual parts of the novel, which is like, it does describe a very ugly and unconsensual, by the way, sex between, like, that, because something is between the teacher and Vanessa. And reading through this, you can never say that there was any love involved.
Thank you very much. And I think this this also refers to Lolita, but even in more complex way, because I was rereading the novel before our seminar, and we also discussed it with my friends. And when I didn't read it when I was a teenage girl, but some of my friends did. And for a teenage girl, that's really the love story. And then now I'm being 30 years old and knowing about everything about Me Too movement and everything. And I'm reading the scene, the first scene with Lolita and Humbert. They are in this hotel, and it's I don't know, that I was shocked and I was terrified because it's so beautifully written. And at the same time, you understand that this is a grown man who gave sleeping pills to a 12-year-old girl, and he's trying to make some moves to a sleeping child. And the thing is, there are also it's pointed out from time to time that she is a child. Nabokov points it out, and it's very scary to read it now.
I never read it as a teenager myself as well. I think I was in my early 20s when I read it first, and so I also never had this like it was never seducing me. But I do understand two things. First thing, that we all use the word beautiful many times during this, like first 40 minutes of discussion. We will use it much more because it is beautifully written. And I understand that it's seductive by its beauty. That like when you open the novel and you see that art is so much more beautiful than anything that you can live through, anything that you can experience, then painful as it is, this situation seems seductive, seems more wanted than what you can go through, what you can go through. Like what can happen to you, a teenage boy in a car, like after the prom party, like nothing interesting. But it's amazing to be a part of the novel or to be a part of the world so beautifully described. And I guess here it is seducing to a young mind.
Lisa, thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to our French colleagues. And yes.
Yes, thank you, Pauline. So we are starting to share Mary's screen. So before I start, I would like to thank you, Tatiana and Pauline, for having invited us, Marie Boucher, Julie Loison-Charles, and myself to take part in this seminar session. So we choose to focus our presentation on a very sensitive subject at the moment in France, which is the questions of abuse, rape, and incest in relationship with rereadings of Lolita. So it started in France with the publication of a book at the very beginning of January 2020. So this book is entitled in French Le Consentement, and Consent, a memoir in its English translation. And this book was written by Vannessa Springorы, who is now the head of the French publishing house Julliard. So at the age of 47, Springorы gives a personal version of the sexual relationship she had when she was a teenager with a very famous French writer of 50 at that time, now he is 84, named Gabriel Masneff. So Tatiana reminded us, is it a coincidence? This writer is of Russian origin. His parents have been Russian immigrants who arrived in France fleeing the Russian Revolution. This book is a first because until its publication, None of the children or teenagers who had a love affair with Masnev ever said a word about it, even as a grown-up. So Springore's book is what was called by a journalist the story of a domination. First, this is a story of a sexual domination. After she met at 13, the famous writer at a dîner mondain, after which he seduced her by sending her love letters. Then they started to have sexual intercourse just before she turned 14. Vanessa even lived with him in the room he was renting in a hotel of the Latin Quarter. And she describes how she really believed she was in love with him, dazzled by the conception of being the chosen one. But at 15, she discovered in books written by her lover that first, she never had been, as Masnev always claimed, a unique and sacred love. Indeed, the writer had always been a collector of virgins, passionate about checking their virginity. And in what she judges pornographic pages of her second book, she discovered that Masnev lacked to travel to Asia in order to have paid sexual intercourse with very young boys. After that, she left him, a fact that Masnev never managed to accept. Springora recounts how she was destroyed by this relationship, as the main question she couldn't answer was the one of consent. What she's stressing indeed in her book is that sexual abuse committed by a man presenting himself as an expert is insidious and perverse, and based upon the vulnerability of the victim. I quote, "Very often, in the case of sexual abuse or abuse of the vulnerable, one comes across the same denial of reality, the same refusal to consider oneself a victim. And indeed, how is it possible to acknowledge having been abused when it's impossible to deny having consented, having felt desire, for the very adult was so eager to take advantage of you? For many years, I struggled with the very idea of the victim and was incapable of seeing myself as one," unquote. I finish with explaining how Springora escaped this dilemma. Sexual domination was doubled by literary domination. That is, as she analyzes it, a form of self-dispossession, as she became a fictional character in Masnev diaries, regularly published by Gallimard, in which he was describing his love affairs with young girls, including the one with little V. And the solution she found to escape this domination, with the words she chose to present it, will remind you, of course, of Nabokov's novel. I quote, "For many years I passed around my cage, my dreams filled with murder and revenge, until the day when the solution finally presented itself to me like something that was completely obvious. Why not ensnare the hunter in his own trap, ambush him within the pages of a book?" And this book, of course, is a memoir entitled Consent. And now I will, it's your turn, Julie. Over to you.
So we're going to show you an excerpt when Gabriel Masnev was invited on Bernard Pivot's show, Apostrophe. And Brian Boyd, thank you for reminding us of this anecdote with the whiskey, because we were not going to talk about it, but I think that's quite a nice anecdote. So in 1990, on the 30th of May, Gabriel Maznev was invited to promote the publication of one of the volumes of his diary. And you'll see that there's also a Canadian author called Denise Bombardier, who's invited to talk about her novel, Tremblement de Cœur. And Marie, I don't know if she's been able to do that. We prepared a translation into English for everyone. So I think we'll try and put it in the dialog box. There you go, it's actually in it. So you can click on it and read it while the video goes.
Hold on, I need to stop sharing and reshare because I forgot to share my sound. So that should work better now. Oh yeah, it's my turn. Julie, did you want to say anything else? Actually, no, that was it.
I think we can. Yeah, it's probably it. Just I think you all noticed how people are laughing and smiling, and we'll contrast that to something else later on.
Okay. Actually, in her book, Vannessa Springora speaks about Lolita. This is what she says. So, what characterizes sexual predators in general and pedophiles in particular is the refusal to acknowledge the gravity of their acts. They tend to represent themselves as victims. They were seduced by a child or a female temptress, or as benefactors who did only good to their victims, as we could see in the excerpt. In Lolita, Nabokov's novel, which I read and reread at first met G, the reader is, on the contrary, confronted with confusing disclosures. Humbert pens his confession in the psychiatric hospital where he later dies, not long before his trial. He does not go easy on himself at all. How lucky Lolita was! At least she obtained this compensation, the unambiguous recognition of her stepfather's guilt, in the voice of the very person who had stolen her childhood. How unfortunate that she was already dead when he made this confession. Nowadays, I often hear it said that a work like Nabokov's, were it to be published today in our so-called neo-Puritan era, would inevitably encounter censorship. And yet, I don't think that Lolita is even remotely an apology for pedophilia. Quite the contrary, it's the strongest possible denunciation of it, the most compelling ever written on the subject. I never believed that Nabokov was a pedophile. Obviously, his persistent interest in such a subject, subversive subject, which he tackled twice, first in The Enchanter in his native Russian, and then and then later in English with the iconic Lolita, which garnered worldwide success, raised a few suspicions. Nabokov might indeed have struggled against such a predilection. I couldn't possibly know. But, despite all of Lolita's subconscious perversity, despite her games of seduction and her stolid simpering, Nabokov never tried to make Humbert pass for a benefactor, and still less for a decent person. The tale of his character's passion for young girls, an unrestrained and pathological passion that tortured him throughout his entire life, is on the contrary implacably clear-sighted. In his books, G comes across as far from contrite or self-questioning, not a trace of regret or remorse. Reading him, you might imagine he was brought into this world to offer adolescents the fulfillment that a culture of inhibition denied them, to open them to their desires, reveal their sensuality, develop their capacity to give and receive. Such a capacity for self-denial merits a statue in the Luxembourg Gardens, she writes. Such a correct interpretation of Lolita as a victim and not a temptress is actually reflected in dictionary definitions. You'll see that. So that's, for example, in the French dictionary Le Robert. I have the translation there. What is a Lolita? And you'll see that in French, Lolita lost its capital letter, becoming a common noun. Very young girl who provokes male desire through her image of precocious femininity, c'est nymphette. Or even in the Cambridge Dictionary online, Lolita, what's a Lolita? It's a young girl who has a very sexual appearance or behaves in a very sexual way. So obviously the word victim isn't there at all. I would say that this correct reading is not, unfortunately, the most widespread reading in prominent literary circles. As was shown and evidenced in the 1907 apostrophe interview. So that's Julie, I think it's over to you now. Oh, sorry, yeah, no, crosswords, not important.
Sorry. Yeah, so you remember this interview from 1975. We might have a chance to talk about it, but 4 months later, Masnev will be invited for the first time there. The one we saw before was the 6th time he was interviewed. So here we chose an excerpt where Pivot has the same kind of question and he's laughing and kind of suggesting things to Nabokov. And you'll see just how Nabokov is reacting completely differently and cutting him short. Oh, and sorry, we're using the translation into English by Brian, the one that was published in his latest book, so Think, Write, Speak. I don't know if it's already in the discussion box.
Yes, I placed it in the chat for people to download it if you don't understand French. Maybe if you understand Spanish, it's subtitled in Spanish. So.
Oui, c'est mon grand dad. Vladimir.
Okay. So, right. Okay. So, so Denis Bombardier was, as you could see, a very lonely voice in 1990, and you could see the clear continuation of that in Bernard Pivot's own reading of Lolita in 1975. But victims now talk. And even more important, not only are they talked, but they're also heard and read. So I'm quickly going to mention the book that Michael mentioned in the chat earlier. So Christophe Tison, 2019, but he had himself published in 2004 a book where he recounted the abuse that he himself suffered from a friend of his parents for many, many years as a teenager. And of course, the one book that is in the news in France is Camille Kouchner's book, La Familia Grande, which is the account of what happened in her family as her stepfather sexually assaulted and raped her brother, her twin brother, for many years when they were teenagers. And it took her many, many years to finally write about it and publish this book. It so happens that she comes from a prominent family in France. Her father is her stepfather, Olivier Duhamel, who had to resign from all his prominent positions, but is a very famous economist and law professor who is, friends with many politicians, major politicians in the Socialist Party, especially. So this created a major scandal, of course, the revelation of something that was actually known by a lot of people, but never publicly shown, and people were told to just hush and not speak about it. So the publication of that book also launched a new hashtag. Brian was mentioning that Nabokov would never even imagine that this could exist, but the Me Too and incest in French created on January 16, and 2 days later there were already several thousand messages on Twitter, tweets of victims explaining how they had been abused themselves. There is a major moment of awareness right now in France of that issue, with an estimate of probably one French person in 10 suffered some form of incest from a relative, meaning a family member, a stepfather, obviously, which is something that actually Nabokov himself had clearly pointed out in Lolita. And if you actually remember this quote, they are at the Enchanted Hunters, and there's only one room for the two of them, and Humbert tells Lolita, "Look here, Lo, let's settle this once and for all. For all practical purposes, I am your father. I have a feeling of great tenderness for you, and in your mother's absence, I'm responsible for your welfare. We are not rich, and while we travel, we shall be obliged, we shall be thrown a good deal together. Two people sharing one room inevitably enter into a kind, the word is incest," said Lo. I think we're gonna, maybe in questions we'll tell you what is going on right now, so in terms of law, but we would like to conclude by a very firm refutation of Bernard Pivot's analysis, and saying that and in the wake of the Springora book, this is what he tweeted in the 1970s and 1980s. Literature came before morals. Today, morals come before literature. Morally speaking, it shows some progress. We are more or less the intellectual and moral products of a country, and above all, of an era. But we want to stress that even beyond a fallacious historical or cultural argument, we wholeheartedly disagree with this type of statement, which on top of it comes from somebody who complacently delighted, in the hateful books written by Masnev, and granted him 6 times the honor of his TV show. Clearly, Pivot misread Nabokov, failing to see its utmost moral value, carefully woven in the interstices, the contradictions, the hypocritical stances of its narrator. But maybe because Lolita is not didactic fiction, as Nabokov says in the afterword, and requires for the reader to have a certain sense of morals along with sharp reading skills, some readers, and however prominent, misunderstood and misunderstand it. And we just want to thank you for your attention. There.
Thank you very much. Tatiana Levina, maybe you have some questions to our colleagues before we move to the discussion.
No, actually, it's probably yes. It's a question, but also it's more of a comment than a question. It's yes. I think it happened. Yes, it happened. That was we now learn about the public opinion in France in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and now it's changing. But of course, in the Soviet Union, no such discussion could take place in those years because Lolita was banned and could not be discussed publicly. But now, in my 20 years in the museum, you just can't imagine how many discussions I had with visitors or with people who were in the museum for some purpose, or usually visitors, and discussion exactly that kind. When I heard that it's a book about love, it's a love story, and when I told them that, well, just let's put this straight: who loves who? And then usually they would tell me, well, they love each other. Which, of course, is something that, yes, that this Masnev tried us to believe, yes, that there was mutual love. So it's still there. This feeling is still there. Of course, as is, I'm not being biased, but of course, I think most of you realize that most of these statements came from men, which is, of course, quite logical. And there was even a discussion on the Russian on the St. Petersburg TV years ago when we discussed it in this in the very narrow circle of scholars, and even scholars. I can tell you something. I was the only woman in the discussion. There were two male scholars, and yes, the subject was the same. They told me, but it's a book about love. Love, yes, of course, there is love, and again, they to my question, who loves who, there was no real answer. The only argument that somehow made them think about the subject of the discussion when I told them that, but you must remember that we know this story from Humbert, and he is writing for the jury. He's writing for the jury. He's this Canadian writer mentioned literature as alibi, but yes, he's writing it as his alibi. He's trying us to believe. He's writing it for the jurors, for them to believe that he is a victim too, that he is innocent. Then, of course, I think they started thinking, and probably we should somehow remind the readers that yes, that this is he's preparing his speech for the jury. He's thinking it's his alibi, and maybe this is something that would let even not only teenagers, yes, talk about teenagers, how they sadly read the book, many of them, but even grown-ups, even adults, maybe that will let them see deeper into the into the novel and into Nabokov's stand. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you very much for your comment.
I may just add, Tatiana, indeed, you're right in pointing that the prominence of the male point of view, and until recently in France too, and actually what helped for the publicity of those two books, whether Springore's or Camille Kushner's, is that there were newspaper articles published just before the publication of both of those books that were not only reviewing the books, but explaining who is G in the novel, who's the stepfather in the other one. And those newspaper articles were both written by female journalists. So the female voices also tend to be more heard and published nowadays in France.
Mary, thank you very much. And speaking about male point of view, I would like now to give the floor to the other participant of our discussion, Igor Kirienkov. Igor, would you mind saying a few words?
Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to join this circle. I would like to thank Agnès, Marie, Julie, Lisa, and Brian for the beautiful words. And I would like to add some thoughts about the conventions of modernist art, the Nabokov case itself, and the reception of Nabokov and Lolita in modern Russian media. First of all, I feel kind of surprised that today in 2021, we've begun to read Nabokov as realistic prose, treat him as a typical realistic writer from the curriculum. I can't say I'm a huge fan of postmodern theory, but I believe that Nabokov understood, so to say, the artificiality of art, and his characters, such as Humbert or Van or Lolita, are not the same of Dickens or Tolstoy, and his plots are not the banal depictions of reality. But it doesn't mean that Nabokov's ethics is irrelevant. On the contrary, it's a true miracle that in his novels, the didacticity is both hidden and obvious. And yes, Nabokov doesn't romanticize rape or abuse or cruelty, even though his protagonists might. Secondly, I believe we can all agree that Nabokov is a writer who used the figure of unreliable narrator in the most ambitious ways. And the great lesson of his art, if art can teach lessons at all, is that we should be very careful when reading or listening to professional gaslighters such as Humbert or German or Van. He teaches us how to cope with fake news, basically. And we should read very careful and be adamant to all sorts of enchantments those murderers, rapists, or just vile characters try to cast. And lastly, the reception of Nabokov in modern media is very dubious. There is a tradition of treating him as a modern, both elitistic and popular classic. This year, partly due to the publication of Vanessa, we can see a new tendency. It's not that someone demands to cancel Nabokov in these very words, but the question why we should read novels narrated by evil white males are raised more and more often. Instead, it seems like these readers prefer the story of Sally Horner and LaSalle written in journalistic language rather than multi-dimensional work of art. My point is that if we play this game, to my mind quite obsolete, what did author want to say? Nabokov is on the right side of history. He is always on the side of those who are abused, who are diminished, and we can clearly read it from Lolita or Ada, and it's our job as readers and our joy also to find what or who the protagonist has hidden.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. I know that also Vera Polishuk wanted to make some adjustments to our discussion.
Thank you. I would like to give you some context on Lolita and my dog Vanessa, and I think it's very important. It would be helpful to say a few words about Lolita's context and the successes of the novel. In my opinion, my dog Vanessa by now is a closing link in a long succession of books and even films reflecting the cultural reception of the novel. To begin with The Collector by John Fowles in 1963 and The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch in the 1973. Both novels were in a way polemical. And in the beginning, the main idea was justifying the figure of a maniac in general, and in some cases also justifying a murderer, justifying by his love to his victim and giving him voice and the possibility to speak his heart. But in this succession, of course, we can see not only maniacs and abusers, but also adult men driving to young girls and giving us explanations and justifying themselves. Also, I should say that after Lolita's publication and after after the movie by Stanley Kubrick, there was a great number of films about a love story between an adult man and a young girl, a teenager girl. And it's very interesting and thought-provoking to trace Lolita's traces in cinema. And a great number of films in a certain way contained homages to Lolita or playing with the novel's plot, but emphasizing different emotional issues. I can name many films, but I think it would be enough to name just a few of them. For example, Noche Blanche by Jean-Claude Brissot, White Wedding, and Stepfather Beaupère by Bertrand Blier. And also there was funny reflections upon Lolita in Polish cinema because there was a double parody, Sarah, a parody on Leon by Luc Besson. And the most interesting example is American Beauty by Sam Mendes. It was a reflection upon Lolita, and it was full of play with the novel and full of different allusions. And also, it seems to me it's very important to trace Lolita's influence in Soviet, post-Soviet, and contemporary Russian literature. Because there was a long succession of different novels and short stories echoing Lolita in some way. For example, the novel by Olga Slavnikova, Alone in a Mirror, short stories by Lyudmila Ulitskaya, Golubchik and Bronka, Diary and Bronka, and her novel Sonichka, her novel Sincerely Yours Shurik. There was a novel by Marina Stepnova, Lazar's Women, and especially her novel, The Surgeon. And a very interesting example, a detective story by Polina Dashkova, The Eternal Night. Mostly these works have something to do with Lolita's special role in the Soviet Union and Russia as a forbidden book on forbidden love, not about a case of child abuse. And usually the main characters associate themselves with one of characters, mostly with Humbert, or they show some similarities to him. And in some novels or short stories, the main character is unaware of his likeness, but the author emphasizes it. And for example, in The Eternal Night, an elderly, well-educated post-Soviet man reads the famous novels, as far as I remember, in Samizdat, and justifies his infatuation with a teenager girl, though he is still tormented with guilt. But what is significant from my point of view? For Soviet and post-Soviet characters and writers, Lolita is, in the first place, is associated with being different from ordinary people, hiding one's thoughts and true thoughts and feelings, and in a way being a secret rebel. And reading the novel is an act of rebellion, and likeness to Humbert is a symbol of loneliness and being a dissident. And I think it's very interesting, but as you can see, the very core of reception of Lolita in Russia is very different from European and American. And I think it's also very thought-provoking to read Russian reviews on My Dark Vanessa. Thank you.
Vera, thank you very much, dear colleagues. So now is the time for the comments, additions, questions. So do not hesitate to switch on your microphones or write. If you have questions, you can write them in chat window and I can read them.
I guess I'll make a comment that's also a question, if I may. I find all of the presentations compelling and fascinating. And one thing that was crossing my mind is the thread between them, beginning with Brian's comments on the morality and Nabokov's claims about the work not having a moral in tow and yet being a very moral work. And of course, he wrote elsewhere that all art is moral if it's true art. I was realizing that perhaps what Nabokov was trying to do here was something almost impossible, not yet clear if it's impossible, but he was really trying to thread that needle or follow that fine ridge, as he puts it in The Gift, between creating a work that is almost maximally moralizing and moralistic, but at the same time trying to hide that maximal moral quality. And he set a challenge to the public and to his readers that is, it's a phenomenal challenge. And of course, many readers failed it early on and still continue to fail it. He must have recognized that many readers would fail it, and he must have hoped that readers would overcome that and have a kind of a moment of recognition, a shock of recognition of error as they grew with the novel. But it seems to me a fascinating structure that he created this work, which is so, I mean, it's in a way the most painfully moral of his works, I think. I don't know, I'd have to put them all out in front of me and think about them one by one to be sure if I like that statement. But it's you know, the most deeply morally engaged of his works, I think. And at the same time, he's, and maybe therefore, he's completely committed to defending it from a moralizing attitude, because that's what he feels is correct to do with art, and also because of his history in Russian and Soviet attitudes towards utility in art and that kind of thing. I don't know if there's a question in there, but I just felt that was an interesting angle to add that was brought about by all of these papers. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Brian, would you like to comment somehow?
Oh, I just unmuted myself. Yes, you can hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's lots I would have liked to have commented on. When Lisa said that, talking about the way it's Lolita is being read and discussed in Russia now, will Nabokov's novel ever be read again as it was read? Well, depends on who you're talking about as reading it in the past. Vera Nabokov read it correctly, and no doubt Nabokov himself did. And there are amazingly appalling misreadings by novelists and critics like Robertson Davies and Lionel Trilling, who could see only Lolita, see Humbert as the victim. I mean, it was just appalling how badly they misread the novel, the victim of the seductive little minx. Something that came to mind just before Steve Blackwell spoke was the idea that Lolita really reads its readers. And most readers don't realize, or many readers who misread it don't realize that they've failed the test of reading it. Steve had a nice comment about readers growing with the book as they learn to understand it better, and I think that's a lovely idea. Except that most readers do not, most misreaders do not recognize that they've been misreading it so badly. They do think it's a love story. I mean, I like the way Tatiana Ponomaryova responded to people who thought that it was a love story. Who's in love with who? Another way of looking at it too might be to think about it in terms of Nabokov's relationship to Vera. Look at the start of the letters to Vera, and what he's interested in is in the way her mind is in tune with his. There's just no interest whatever in Humbert about Lolita's mind being in tune. He only wants her body to be available, and it's just such it is a book about desire that masquerades itself as love most of the time. And of course, Lolita feels no desire whatever. She's attracted to Humbert to some extent until what happens at the Enchanted Hunters, and then she experiences no desire ever again. If we read carefully. That'll do.
Thank you very much, Brian. Since you mentioned,
can I add something? Yes, thank you. Yes, just a little comment. Exactly, because I was well, unlike most of you, I've spent all these years talking not only to scholars but to a very wide audience of readers of very different backgrounds, very different cultural backgrounds, and readers and reading experiences. So that's why I mentioned my many talks about whether it's a love story or not. And I think I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. Why it's read in why Lolita reads its reader. Yes, that's I agree completely. But I think what happened is that Nabokov, as I think, wrote for the kind of reader that he had been writing for before. He had his audience. Of course, mostly in his Russian years, had the audience which was not very big. Nabokov was never a very successful writer in terms of print runs. Like in the Russian emigration, for example, there were other writers who were much more successful, had a lot more readers, who wrote well, novels, action novels, like I don't know, like Krasnov, for example. He was much more successful. Nabokov had his devoted audience of very intellectual readers who could really read his novels the way they should be read. And I think when he started writing novels not stories, but novels in English for the English language audience, he was still writing for the same kind of audience. He was writing for his limited intellectual audience that could, as he knew, could read his novels in the right way. But what happened that when Lolita unexpectedly became a bestseller, the audience changed completely. Now its audience was made up of millions of people without much reading experience, who were simply attracted to the subject matter of the novel, or attracted because it was a bestseller. And that changed this perspective completely. That's how I see it. Maybe I don't know if I'm right, but that's how I've always seen it, because there must be some explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana Olegovna. And I wanted.
Could I just respond to that? The example, people like Robertson Davies and Lionel Trilling, who were accomplished novelists and academic literary critics, they misread the novel. It wasn't just that there was this new audience. These were the kinds of people who would have been reading Nabokov's earlier fiction, but they completely failed with Lolita.
Yes, exactly. Yes, you're right. Yes, actually, you're right, Brian. Yes, and my experience, I mentioned this talk with scholars. Yes, this maybe not. There may be not so many of them. Most of the people in the literary world they can read. But yes, it happens. I agree. That happens, and it's happened to me too. Even with scholars. Yes, that's true. Thank you. Yes, I didn't think of it. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's even more complex than my theory suggests. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if I can jump in with a comment which turns into a question like Steve's. I wonder if one of the problems of misreading with this novel is the fact that in modern times we associate love exclusively with something beneficent, and we associate it with care in all times. And this dichotomy between, is it a love story or is it a story about abuse? I wonder if it's a false dichotomy, that it's actually both, that it is a love story and it's also about abuse, because love can manifest itself in abusing ways, in harmful, damaging ways. And in bringing this to our attention, perhaps Nabokov is joining other writers who are also anti-modern in this way, by showing us that love can be abusive and it can still be called love. I'm thinking of Toni Morrison, for instance, who insists at the end of The Bluest Eye that the father who rapes his daughter still loves her, that this horrible, very damaging act of rape does not bracket out the fact that he also loved her. Proust consistently shows love to be an illness. Erasmus tells us that love doubled is insanity. So we have lots of examples where love is not this pure free pass towards virtue, but love is rather something really complex and potentially not beneficent and associated with care. So I know this is kind of provocative and we don't want to hear it, but is that possible, that love itself is to blame in this false dichotomy between, is it a love story or is it a story that shows us how damaging abuse can be?
Donna, thank you very much for your comment.
Yes, I think I just think Donna, I think this is a term. Are we in the terminology field now? Yes, what we call love in different languages. Yes, this is but that's a very good. Yes, thank you. That's a very good.
And in different times, right? We
different times. Yes.
Yeah.
Different cultures. Yes, in different cultures, languages, and times. Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. That's what this Gabriel Matzneff wanted us to believe, that he was just part of this, I don't know, ancient Greek and Roman culture. What's wrong with that? Yes, we are back into the glorious days of the Roman Empire. Why? What's wrong? Why? I'm not to blame. There is nothing wrong with that. Yes. So you're right.
And Lionel Trilling does that same mistake. Lionel Trilling's entire review is couched in, this is a novel from a different time. We're meant to read this as romance, as feudal romance, rather than a realistic account of what's happening today.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. I'm Trilling too. Yes, you're right. Yes, I remember that too.
Thank you very much. I see the hand raised. Charles?
Yes, thank you very much for, I was invited a few years ago to this seminar. I had no idea that existed. So the French colleagues who are also part of IFEA, the Associations of Teachers of American Literature in France, drew my attention to this. And I've been teaching Lolita in a bachelor program here at Université des Antilles in Martinique for the past 3 years. And of course, with the attention drawn to the question of, Me Too and then Me Too incest, etc., it's become extremely difficult to deal with this book in class, as literature. So I've had the hardest time convincing my third-year students in the BA program that Lolita is a fascinating novel. It is art. Okay, this was a very difficult question, of course, especially in today's discussion, okay, of what is proper or not proper, but it is basically a great book. And the situation was perhaps it was more difficult for me that here in Martinique, the 40 students that I have in the third-year program of English studies are, well, 75% girls who are extremely aware of their appearance, okay, constantly on their phones and taking pictures of themselves in class, okay, because they're amazingly aware of their image. And making them become aware of the interest of a book in the first place, okay, is not easy at all. So if I chose to teach Lolita here in the program in Martinique, it's because 10 years ago, it was in the program, the official program for the preparation of the national contest for teachers of English, okay, who had to study works of literature, okay, and then take part in this national contest. And Lolita was the novel, okay, on the program for 2 years. So all French students who wanted to become teachers of English had to read the novel, okay, and study it. And that's how I got into that. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I managed to get my students to really read them. Of course, the greatest difficulty is explaining the language, okay? All the gains of the different levels, you know, on which Nabokov wrote this amazing book. It's also a picture of the United States. So explaining that to students who've never been there also, you know, and how, I mean, Humbert, you know, fits, you know, as a European emigre in that society. All of this is fascinating, but it is couched in very difficult words, in also, you know, a construction that is so difficult to decipher, especially for students whose, of course, native tongue was not English. But it's been fascinating, and I'm still convinced that it is worth the effort.
Thank you very much for your comment. And Monica, you also raised your hand.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our speakers for this wonderful panel. Thank you for your beautiful interventions. My question overlaps in part with the comments that we've just heard from Charles Schell. So my question is the following. Have any of today's speakers taught Lolita since the beginning of the Me Too movement? And how has your approach to the novel changed? Have you offered different contextualizations? Have you had different reactions? I haven't taught Lolita in a while. I taught it when it was on the syllabus of the Agrégation in 2009 to 2011. And I'm very curious about how you would go about it, and whether you've had a recent experience of teaching Lolita, and any recommendations, advice, suggestions you might have.
Can I just, because it's pretty much in the same train of thoughts, I just wanted to mention that here in Toulouse, in France, the American literature professors, we gather to choose which books we're going to put on the syllabus for our third-year BA students. And I suggested that we place Lolita on the syllabus again, so because it hadn't been on the syllabus for 15 years or so, because I think it's also an important book to teach for many reasons, because it's a book about what consent is, because it's a book about what, you know, abuse is. But I didn't manage to convince my other colleagues, which I was one of them in Nabokovian, actually. And the reasons that were, which I see as well, that were given for not putting Lolita back on the syllabus is that today, the awareness I was talking about of now we know that 1 in 10 French people have been abused by, a relative. Probably 1 in 5 women have been sexually assaulted or abused in some way. And the point was that today victims talk, and we thought that it would be extremely maybe difficult, something we were absolutely not aware of when we taught it back in 2006 to 2009 in BA, was that we were not aware of the potential victim among our students in the classroom. And the fact that now we know that for sure in a group of 40 students, you're bound to have a few victims of abuse. And that's the reason why we said, okay, probably not a good idea, because we don't feel trained to address those issues with our students. And we know how to teach literature, but I'm not a psychologist who can help. And you know what I'm saying? We don't feel, I think a lot of my colleagues were scared of having to deal with those things. And we feel absolutely unprepared, I guess, which is sad because it's a book, it's literature, but it's also proof of the power also of literature in when you read a story, and if you are a victim yourself, I can imagine how even more powerfully this book could resonate. So just to give you the a little account of the discussion that took place in Toulouse less than a month ago.
Thank you very much, Marie.
I just taught the novel. I could say a couple of words about the experience if that would be useful for Monica, though I'm not on the panel, so I don't know if I'm appropriate to step in here.
Absolutely appropriate.
Okay, thanks. So what I found interesting about it, I mean, it was in a Nabokov class, so I think that Marie's concerns or her colleagues' concerns are taken care of when a course itself is entirely devoted to Nabokov, because if it's an optional course, probably most students, all students who sign up are aware of the novel and its content, and they'll select out if they don't think they can handle it. One can always, of course, offer an accommodation in the moment if needed. But given that they're reading it because they choose to read it, I found very interesting to address a couple of points. One is one that I probably was already addressing before Me Too, which is my sense that Nabokov was hyper aware of American cultures, but perhaps all of Western cultures, hypersexualization and commodification of women and female sexuality. This is something that he makes an object of his scorn and observation without trying to seem moralizing about it, but he's clearly putting it forward as a moral lesson. And so despite the fact that a narrator like Humbert is trying to seduce us into accepting his point of view, we're meant to break through that seduction at some point if we can become good readers. And Brian is not optimistic for most of humanity, it seems, sadly. But with our students, or perhaps with the Me Too movement in pocket. And that's the other issue that came up that was very interesting, to talk to students about the fact that, now as we read this in a class, and as they read it as students with the Me Too era so close at hand and at the top of their minds, maybe, it's impossible really to be seduced by Humbert in that way. It's impossible, I think, for most students to be as tricked by him as readers were for decades, when readers were more naive about these things. And so we talked about how interesting it is that we can read this novel with a kind of a greater knowledge and a certain advantage, in a way a disadvantage, if it's a disadvantage not to be seduced by Humbert and then have to overcome that seduction. So earlier readers, perhaps, I read it as an 18-year-old, I guess, for the first time. I don't think I was completely seduced by Humbert, but I must have been somewhat seduced by him, and I must have believed him when he said, I have to tell you something very strange, reader. It was she who seduced me. I must have bought that, at least for a while. So at any rate, talking with students about how different they are from the first decades of readers, and how different their perspective is on what's going on in the novel, and also just a constant attention to the ways that Humbert manipulates. That's a way to keep everything about the novel fresh and relevant, alive, and looking towards the future, I think. So that's worked well for me in class.
And thank you very much. If it's possible, I would like to add a word, because I'm not teaching Lolita, but I thought a lot about it recently because of Vanessa, and I think we already talked a little bit about it, but I think when it's quite important to me that we need to teach how to read Lolita, and it's quite obvious through our discussion, because as I see young girls in Russia, for example, in Russia it's very popular to read Lolita when you are a teenager. My classmates did it, a lot of my friends did it, but they do it quite wrong, because most of them read just only the content of the book, but they do not seem to understand how the book is made, its structure, that we are dealing with unreliable narrator, and it's a literary, the kind of literary device. So I think we need to teach also how this book is made, as how it works, which devices are used to make this impression on the reader. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Yes, Polina, yes, thank you for mentioning it, because returning to this question with this teenage visitor to the museum that I mentioned in the very beginning, who said that Lolita's life was so interesting. And I told her, but she died at 16. Did she? And the girl said she didn't know she died. She didn't notice that when she was reading the book. She didn't connect. Of course, she didn't connect the foreword, which mentions Lolita's death, with the story, with Humbert's speech before the jurors. She didn't connect the two parts. Maybe it's become rare now when we have there's so much discussion on the internet, and there are these resources, at least in Russian, where you can read just the story, the plot. There are all kinds of resources like that to make reading easier for school students. But that conversation took part maybe about 15 years ago, and she didn't know. So obviously that's how a lot of teenagers read the book. Yes, they don't make this connection. They don't know what happened to the characters. So yes, you're right. This is one of the ways to talk about the book.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tatiana. And I wanted to add that I didn't say that I only spoke about the teenagers when I was teenager, but because I really don't know what modern teenagers read, and do they read Lolita? What impression do they have? And maybe they do not read as much as we used to. That's also an interesting question. But maybe some of our keynote speakers would like to add something to the question, because the question was addressed to them in the first place.
Or maybe some of you have yes, it's teenage students or teenage children that you can share as the experience.
I've taught Lolita since the early 1980s. And I always began my class saying, I expect there'll be some in this class who have suffered abuse. And I know it's going to be hard to read this book, but stick with it. Nabokov is on your side. And You know, I think, you know, that would seem to be a way of countering the anxieties that Marie and her colleagues faced. Just bring it up straight away. I mean, clearly, some may feel that they're re-traumatized by reading it, but I think, you know, as I've mentioned a number of times, sex abuse therapists think Lolita is just a fabulous resource, and if they think that, they use it with the people they're treating. Maybe they have different ways of handling student anxieties than we do as teachers, but yeah, I think if you show what's really going on in the book, students who have been abused will come to appreciate the novel. And I have taught people who have been horrifically abused, more abused than Lolita was. Yeah, and they came to admire the novel very much. So.
Can I jump in? I agree with what Brian said, and many people said. Actually, there's a comment in the dialogue box about someone talking about the cathartical power of Lolita. And another thing I would like to use is Stephen mentioned, it depends if the student chooses it or not. And I think the concern that some colleagues are having, maybe especially in the United States, is this idea of cancel culture. I think it's one of the hashtags you mentioned. I think the fear is that some students are just going to be offended by the fact that it's compulsory to study this book and will want some kind of, I mean, it's what some people are talking about with Black Lives Matter. I think the concern for some people is that if they put it on the program, and I agree it shouldn't be censored, I guess some people are afraid that they will have a backlash and that it's too fresh, especially with the question of Me Too incest at the moment in France. So I think some people are actually not thinking of censoring Nabokov, but are actually using self-censorship because they're afraid of the repercussions. I think in France, we're a bit more at ease with that because education is almost free. So you can't say, as some American students said, I pay that much money every year, so I demand to not have to work on this book or that book. So I think it's a question of self-censorship, and that most people who maybe would be cured or helped by Nabokov's book maybe don't even want to try it, and that's the fear that some people in academia have.
Oh, but I could totally see that's one of the things my colleague said, that we don't want students to say, okay, so I'm sorry, I'm a victim, I don't want to work on this. Because contrary to what happens with the Nabokov seminar that Steve described, this is the syllabus for everyone. So all the students registered in English studies have to read those books. So my colleagues just didn't want to face demands such as, I don't want to be evaluated on that book. I don't want to have an exam on it. I don't want to read it. And that's the reason that made it, my other colleagues were convinced that it wasn't a good idea to put Lolita on the syllabus. But I was very pained. And I think that on the contrary, it's a book that's amazing because it shows, the tactics, the rhetoric of abusers. But I don't know how, well, I don't know, maybe 2 years from now, I'll try again when we change the syllabus. But, it's complicated. It's definitely self-censorship. And I felt very sorry to see my professors of literature, my colleagues, to make such a decision. It was so heartbreaking.
I just want to toss out a great comment that one of my students made as we started reading the novel. She noted something that Nabokov couldn't have said also. She said, notice how Humbert is grooming the reader. Using this modern terminology of grooming that we have for sexual predators. I thought that was fantastic and just exactly spot on.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to write it down because I think it's very accurate comment on the novel. Dear colleagues, do you have maybe other questions, or you would like to add something, because we're talking for almost 2 hours, and the topic of our discussion is that, but still it's quite hard to prolong for a lot more. So maybe a few short comments, and then we will start to round up.
If I may add something to what I said before, I never saw the apostrophe videos, that Marie and her colleagues showed. And that was amazing. What I found really wonderful is Nabokov's interview, of course, on apostrophe, because he made it so clear what Lolita is all about and how the book has been misread, by so many people, including clever people. The Matzneff story totally floored me because, okay, I was French born and French raised. I'm glad to say that until recently, I'd never even heard the man's name, for one thing, because I read books instead of watching television. But the attitude of that man, the way that he could talk about his own experiences in the field, in this wonderfully cut suit, as it was, this is what distinguished gentlemen do, that was so mind-blowing that one can understand the outrage today of, so how could the system, how could the French television, put up with this? That is a fascinating question. And I explained to my students when I was in the discussions in class about all that, I said, well, to some extent, and I myself consider myself a victim of the 1968 Cultural Revolution. We had, it was an explosion in France especially, and everything was changed. And there were like injunctions to enjoy, free sex and everything. If you didn't do that, if you didn't challenge the old moral rules, you were considered totally passé, okay? And in retrospect, it is amazing, when I think of what we went through, because we really felt, and on campus too, I was a student in Strasbourg in my BA years, that we had to perform, in as risque ways as possible if we wanted to be, in, right? And that is one dimension that explains that even on a television program meant for the whole country, people like myself could be interviewed, and discuss coolly things that are not just literature, but actually, stories of their own experiences with kids. And today, of course, this is absolutely amazing. I just wanted to say that.
That's actually, if I may add, the kind of situation which happened recently in Russia, when the maniac who was accused of, I'm sorry, I forgot the English word. He took 2 young girls and he kept them as prisoners for a long time. And recently he was let out of the prison. And then he was interviewed by a very famous Russian, I don't know how to call her correctly, not the journalist, but the very famous person, used to be a politician, and it also caused a very, very big discussion in the society.
Yes, but yes, may I just add, but this is yes, his story and the story of this interview, yes, which raised discussion whether you should whether it should be shown or whether it should be censored, and people like that should not be given a voice. But in this case, we have very clear, morally clear situation. He was a convicted criminal. He served his term many years, like something like almost 20 years. And now he is out, and yes, he's given his voice. But what makes, yes, returning to Nabokov's novel, yes, what makes it so controversial, of course, to many readers is that, yes, we're not yes, he's a criminal, but not everyone understands that. Not everyone remembers that he's a criminal in prison, writing for the jury, and after all, he's convicted not for abusing a minor, but for killing another person. So that's yes. But so that's a very different thing, of course. But yes, thank you for reminding us of that, Paulina.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Dear colleagues, I think we need to slowly finish our seminar, and we also for quite a long time have one question on our YouTube channel, and this is the question to Brian, and I would like just to shorten it up because it's quite big, but the main point of question is our listener, she remembers the story about Nabokov wanting to burn Lolita, and Vera stopped him. And she asks why, in Brian's opinion, he wanted to do that. And if I may, I may suggest an answer that our today's whole discussion is a kind of an answer to this question, the controversy of the effect that this novel could have provided. But Brian, what would be your answer?
Yes, turn on. Brian, turn on. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Nabokov never gave any reasons for it, so it's really speculation. I mean, it could have been that it was just artistically, he felt it was too challenging, that he wasn't getting the voice of Humbert right, and if he couldn't get that right, the whole thing would collapse. I don't know. I mean, it could have been anxiety about the effect it might have on his position at Cornell, which he was certainly worried about all the way up to publication and after publication even. That's why he wanted to publish it anonymously at one stage. I don't know. It would have been fascinating to have been able to ask him that question, and he may not even have remembered what his motives were. But it certainly is so uncharacteristic of Nabokov to trash something that he's been working on for a while. I mean, he did abandon some works because of circumstances changing, but to give up a novel that clearly he'd been thinking about it for at least 4 years by then, and putting hard work into it, it is extraordinary that he thought about.
Actually,
about abandoning it.
Yes.
I think he would have. He might well have been appalled at had he been able to foresee then how wildly the novel was going to get misread. I don't know if he anticipated that. As we all know, he made Humbert a perplexingly unreliable narrator, and he succeeded perhaps even more than he wanted to there. I'm not sure. But I don't think we can offer an answer to that.
Can I just thank you, Brian? Can I just add a word? Yes, I think this is so unusual for Nabokov to burn a manuscript that myself I've always doubted the veracity of this story. We don't really know if it's true or not, really, or how accurate it is. So I think it's still a question.
Well, what I wanted to add is that, as Brian showed in his writing, is that Nabokov was definitely very anxious about that book, and I'm sure that the fact that the choice of the first-person narrator obviously exposed him to the I in the book being mixed up with the I that wrote the book, and hence why probably he had the manuscript itself burnt once Vera had typed it out, he didn't keep it. He didn't want something written with his own hand saying such things out of context. It was literally dangerous for him. That's why once it was typed out, he burnt it. So we can see just in that gesture how aware he was of the potentially harmful, misreadings, harmful for his reputation and everything.
Yeah, that's just a very short comment. Sorry, that's what I've been in these many conversations with visitors. That's what another thing I usually said was, imagine, for example, Crime and Punishment written as a first-person narrative. I took an axe, I killed a woman. That, yes, for an average reader, that would be a very different book. So yes, so this is what you just said, Marita. I think that's very important.
Okay, so if we do not have any more comments or additions, I suppose we can finish our today's seminar. Dear participants, I am so incredibly grateful for all your wonderful, interesting and opening new perspectives on different books, presentations, for all your comments and questions. For me personally, this discussion today was very, I don't know, not only the thinking point, but the starting point to continue thinking on all of these texts. And I thank you all for that again. And for being with us today, not maybe, as Tatiana Olegrovna already said, not in the most convenient of the times. And I would like to invite you to watch and to participate maybe in Nabokov readings, the international conference that will be held in the end of June and in the beginning of July. We would love to see you all as also as an audience of our conference. And again, thank you very much for today. And the seminar continue to work, and we will see you maybe in their further meetings. Tatiana Olegrovna, would you like to add something? Sound? You have to switch on.
Sound. Yes, thank you very much. It's been yes, I think I've had a wonderful time. I think it's been a very exciting seminar, exciting discussion. Yes. So our next, as for seminars, we won't have a seminar in June, most probably because there will be a conference soon afterwards. But we'll plan to have our next seminar in August, and we'll certainly let you know the date and the topic of the seminar. And our conference is, we have the usual dates. It's July 1, 2, and 3, but there will be other events. We have many other events, book-related events. So we may even take several neighboring dates. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, and have a nice day. Goodbye.